I'm Sarah, 42 years old, and 3 months ago, my family held a memorial service for me while I was very much alive. They didn't just assume I was dead, they actively planned my funeral, sent out invitations, and even had my brother deliver a eulogy about how I'd finally found peace. The twist? I was watching the entire thing from across the street, and what I did next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all started, because understanding my family dynamics will help you see why they were so quick to write me off as dead rather than missing. Growing up as the middle child between my older sister Rebecca and younger brother Marcus, I learned early that my voice didn't carry much weight in family decisions. My mother, Linda, had always been the type of woman who believed children should be seen and not heard, and even as adults, she expected us to follow her lead without question. My father, Robert, passed away when I was 15, leaving my mother to raise 3 teenagers on her own. Instead of bringing us closer together, his death seemed to create an even sharper hierarchy within our family. Rebecca, being the eldest at 17, was immediately elevated to a co-parenting role that she embraced with enthusiasm. Marcus, the baby at 13, became the precious son who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes. I found myself somewhere in the middle, expected to be responsible like Rebecca but never given the authority, and expected to be grateful like Marcus but never receiving the same level of protection or attention. This pattern continued well into our adult lives. Rebecca married her college boyfriend David and settled into a comfortable suburban life just 20 minutes from our childhood home. She became an elementary school teacher, had 2 children, Emma and Jacob, and seamlessly stepped into the role of the golden daughter who never caused waves. Marcus followed a more traditional path for the favored son, attending law school and joining a prestigious firm downtown. He married his law school classmate Jennifer, and they lived in an expensive downtown condo that my mother loved to brag about to her friends. Then there was me. I had always been drawn to adventure and independence, in ways that made my family uncomfortable. After college, instead of settling down immediately like Rebecca or pursuing a prestigious career like Marcus, I traveled. I spent 2 years teaching English in South Korea, then moved to Colorado to work as a ski instructor. I tried my hand at freelance writing, worked for a nonprofit in Montana, and eventually found my calling as a wilderness guide and outdoor education instructor. My unconventional career path was a constant source of disappointment to my mother. At family gatherings, she would introduce Rebecca as my daughter the teacher, and Marcus as my son the attorney, while I was simply Sarah. When relatives asked about my work, she would wave her hand dismissively and say something like, "Oh, Sarah's still figuring things out," or "She's taking her time finding her path." The fact that I was actually quite successful in my field, that I'd built a reputation as one of the most skilled wilderness guides in the Pacific Northwest, seemed irrelevant to her. My lifestyle choices were equally problematic for my family. I lived in a small cabin I'd renovated myself on 5 acres outside the city limits. I drove an older truck that was reliable but not impressive. I wore practical clothing suited for outdoor work, rather than the business casual that my siblings favored. Most importantly, I remained single by choice, something my mother couldn't understand or accept. Every family gathering became an interrogation about my romantic life. "Sarah, you're not getting any younger," my mother would say, usually in front of everyone. "Don't you want children? Don't you want stability?" When I explained that I was happy with my life, that I enjoyed my freedom and my work, she would sigh dramatically and change the subject as if my happiness was somehow offensive to her. Rebecca would join in with what she probably thought was helpful advice. "Sarah, you know there are plenty of nice men in the city who would appreciate your adventurous spirit. Maybe you should consider moving closer to civilization." The implication was clear. My choices were wrong, my lifestyle was temporary, and I needed to be fixed. Marcus was more subtle but equally dismissive. He would make comments about playing in the woods when referring to my work, or suggest that I might want to consider a real career before it was too late. When I pointed out that I made good money and was building a sustainable business, he would nod patronizingly as if humoring a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. The breaking point in our family dynamic came 3 years ago when my mother had a minor heart episode that required hospitalization. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to scare all of us. Rebecca immediately took charge, organizing schedules for hospital visits, coordinating with doctors, and making decisions about my mother's care. Marcus stepped in to handle the financial and legal aspects, reviewing insurance policies and medical directives. When I offered to help, to take time off work to stay with my mother during her recovery, Rebecca actually laughed. "Oh, Sarah, that's sweet, but Mom needs actual medical support, not nature walks." The comment stung more than I'd expected. I had wilderness first aid training, had dealt with medical emergencies in remote locations, and was perfectly capable of providing basic care and companionship. But my family saw my skills as irrelevant to real-world needs. During my mother's recovery, I visited every day after work, bringing her homemade soup and books I thought she'd enjoy. I set up a small garden outside her window with herbs and flowers. I organized her medications and created a comfortable space for her physical therapy exercises. But Rebecca got credit for being the responsible daughter, and Marcus was praised for handling the important decisions. My contributions were acknowledged with the same tone one might use to thank a child for drawing a get-well card. This pattern of marginalization had been building for decades, but I had always told myself that family was family, that their love came with conditions, but it was still love. I continued showing up for birthdays and holidays, continued trying to bridge the gap between my world and theirs, continued hoping that someday they would see me as an equal rather than a problem to be solved. My work as a wilderness guide brought me incredible satisfaction and introduced me to some of the most interesting people I'd ever met. I specialized in multi-day backpacking trips, rock climbing instruction, and wilderness survival courses. My clients ranged from corporate groups seeking team-building experiences to individuals working through personal challenges to families wanting to connect with nature and each other. One of my regular clients was Dr. Michael Chen, a trauma surgeon, who used my guided trips as a way to decompress from the intensity of his hospital work. We had developed a friendship over the years built on mutual respect and shared love of the outdoors. Michael often said that my guidance had been crucial in helping him maintain his mental health during particularly difficult periods at work. Another regular was Patricia Williams, a retired social worker who had discovered hiking in her 60s and was now completing challenging trail adventures she never would have imagined attempting in her younger years. Patricia often told me that my instruction and encouragement had given her a new lease on life, that she felt stronger and more confident than she had in decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These relationships, built on genuine appreciation for my skills and character, stood in stark contrast to my family's dismissive attitude. In the wilderness, I was respected as an expert. My judgment was trusted. My leadership was valued. People's lives literally depended on my knowledge and decision-making abilities. Yet my own family continued to treat me as if I were an irresponsible teenager who needed guidance and correction. The contrast became even more apparent when I decided to expand my business by purchasing a small outfitting company that was struggling financially. The previous owner, an older man named Frank, had built a solid reputation, but lacked the business skills and energy to keep up with changing market demands. I saw an opportunity to combine his established client base with my expertise and vision for growth. The acquisition required significant financial planning and risk-taking. I had to secure business loans, negotiate the purchase terms, and develop a comprehensive plan for integrating the two operations. It was complex, demanding work that required exactly the kind of business acumen my family claimed I lacked. When I mentioned the expansion at Sunday dinner, expecting at least some acknowledgement of this professional milestone, my family's reaction was predictably dismissive. "That sounds risky, Sarah," my mother said with concern. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? Maybe you should talk to Marcus about the legal implications." Rebecca chimed in with her usual brand of helpful condescension. "Starting a business is so much work, Sarah. And with your lifestyle, do you really have time to be responsible for employees and all that paperwork? Maybe you should stick to what you know." Marcus offered to review my contracts, speaking to me as if I were his first-year associate rather than his sister making a major business decision. "These kinds of deals can be tricky, Sarah. There are liability issues and tax implications you might not have considered." None of them asked about my vision for the company, my plans for growth, or my excitement about the opportunities ahead. They focused entirely on their perception of my limitations rather than my demonstrated capabilities. It was as if they couldn't see past their image of me as the family member who needed to be managed and protected from her own poor judgment. The success of my expanded business over the following months did little to change their attitude. When I hired 3 additional guides and began offering specialized programs for corporate clients, my mother's response was to worry about whether I was taking on too much. When I was featured in a regional outdoor magazine as an emerging entrepreneur in adventure tourism, Rebecca's comment was that she hoped all the attention wouldn't go to my head. Marcus did acknowledge my success, but in a way that somehow minimized it. "It's great that your little outdoor business is doing well," he said at Christmas dinner. "Of course, the outdoor industry is pretty niche. Nothing like a traditional practice that serves real community needs." The implication was clear. My success was cute and temporary, while his work was serious and permanent. This ongoing pattern of dismissal had taught me to keep my personal life largely separate from my family. They knew I lived alone in my cabin, but they'd never visited to see what I'd created there. They knew I worked in the outdoors, but they'd never asked to see photos of the beautiful places I guided people through or hear stories about the transformative experiences my clients had. They certainly didn't know about my relationship with David Murphy, a conservation photographer I'd been seeing for almost 2 years. David and I had met when he hired me to guide him to remote locations for a project documenting endangered wilderness areas. Our relationship had grown slowly and naturally, built on shared values and genuine compatibility. David understood my need for independence and space. He had his own demanding career that required extensive travel, so our relationship worked perfectly for both of us. We would spend intense, wonderful weeks together when our schedules aligned, then maintain our connection through calls and messages when he was traveling for assignments. It was exactly the kind of partnership I'd always wanted. Supportive without being confining, loving without being possessive. I hadn't told my family about David for several reasons. First, I knew they would immediately begin pressuring me about marriage and children, turning our relationship into another referendum on my life choices. Second, I knew they would find ways to criticize him or our unconventional arrangement. Most importantly, David represented a part of my life that was entirely mine, untouched by their judgments and expectations. David knew about my family dynamics and had occasionally suggested that I might be underestimating their capacity for change. "Maybe if they really understood your work and your life, they'd be more supportive," he would say. But I had 3 decades of evidence suggesting otherwise. My family's inability to see me clearly wasn't based on lack of information. It was based on deeply ingrained patterns of thinking that served their own emotional needs. By the time the events of this story began, I had largely accepted the limitations of my family relationships. I continued participating in holidays and major events, but I'd stopped expecting understanding or support. I'd built a fulfilling life filled with work I loved, friends who appreciated me, and a romantic partnership that brought me joy. My family's opinion of my choices had become largely irrelevant to my happiness. This detachment served me well in most situations, but it also meant that when crisis struck, I didn't think to lean on family support. I was accustomed to handling challenges independently, to making decisions without consultation or approval. This independence, which my family saw as stubbornness or poor judgment, would prove crucial when I found myself in an impossible situation that tested everything I thought I knew about survival, trust, and the true meaning of family loyalty. The crisis began on what should have been a routine guided trip in early September. I was leading a 5-day backpacking expedition for a group of 6 experienced hikers who wanted to explore one of the more challenging trail systems in the Cascade Mountains. The group included 2 married couples and 2 individual hikers, all of whom I'd worked with before on less demanding trips. The weather forecast had shown clear skies for the duration of our trip, with typical autumn temperatures and no precipitation expected. We were well prepared with appropriate gear, detailed maps, and multiple communication devices. The trail we planned to follow was well marked and familiar to me, though remote enough to provide the sense of wilderness adventure my clients were seeking. Our first 2 days went exactly as planned. The group was strong and experienced, making good time while still taking opportunities to enjoy the spectacular scenery and wildlife. We camped at designated sites, followed all wilderness protocols, and maintained the safety standards that had earned my business its excellent reputation. On the 3rd day, everything changed. We woke to an unexpected weather system moving in from the west, bringing heavy cloud cover and the possibility of early snow. While not immediately dangerous, the conditions warranted careful monitoring and possible route adjustments. I made the decision to modify our planned route to avoid higher elevation areas where snow accumulation could become problematic. The modified route required us to descend into a valley system that would add approximately half a day to our return journey, but would keep us at safer elevations. I explained the situation to my clients, who agreed that caution was the appropriate choice. We adjusted our supplies and timeline accordingly and began the descent into what seemed like a straightforward, alternative path. It was during this descent that we encountered a situation that would change everything. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came upon a small camp that clearly didn't belong to any legitimate wilderness user. The setup was all wrong. Tarps, strung haphazardly between trees, makeshift shelters that violated wilderness regulations, and equipment that suggested the occupants had been there for an extended period. More concerning were the occupants themselves, 3 men who seemed agitated by our appearance and immediately began asking aggressive questions about our route, our destination, and our communication equipment. Something about their behavior and the setup of their camp triggered my instincts that we were dealing with people involved in illegal activity. My first priority was getting my clients safely away from the situation. I explained quietly that we needed to change our route again, making it sound like a routine adjustment rather than an emergency. My clients, being experienced hikers, sensed the tension and followed my lead without question. As we prepared to leave the area, one of the men from the camp approached me directly. He was agitated and clearly under the influence of something, demanding to know if we had satellite communication devices and whether we had contacted anyone about our location. When I tried to deflect his questions and move my group along, he became more aggressive, eventually blocking our path and making it clear that he wasn't going to let us leave. What happened next unfolded quickly and chaotically. The man grabbed my satellite phone and GPS device, examining them to see if I had transmitted our location. When he found that I had indeed sent routine check-in messages to my base contact, he became enraged. His companions joined him, and suddenly my clients and I found ourselves being detained by people who were clearly involved in something illegal and saw us as a threat to their operation. I realized we had stumbled upon some kind of drug processing operation in the remote wilderness. The men were paranoid, armed, and desperate to prevent any information about their location from reaching law enforcement. They forced us to move to a more secluded area where they could control us while they figured out what to do next. The next several hours were the most terrifying of my life. My clients looked to me for guidance and protection, but I was as helpless as they were. The men holding us were clearly debating what to do with witnesses who could potentially destroy their operation. Some wanted to simply destroy our communication equipment and release us with threats, while others argued that we knew too much and represented too great a risk. As night fell, it became clear that we were in serious danger. The men had been using drugs throughout the day, making their behavior increasingly unpredictable and violent. They had separated my clients from me, keeping them together while holding me apart for questioning. They wanted to know exactly what information I had transmitted, who was expecting to hear from us, and when our absence would be noticed. I provided truthful answers, explaining my standard check-in procedures and the timeline for our expected return. I tried to emphasize that our failure to return would trigger immediate search and rescue operations, hoping this would motivate them to release us rather than harm us. But their paranoia and substance use made rational negotiation nearly impossible. During the night, while my captors were distracted by arguments among themselves about what to do with us, I saw an opportunity for escape. My years of wilderness experience had taught me to move silently through forest terrain, and I believed I could get away and bring help for my clients. It was an enormous risk. If I was caught, the consequences could be severe. But if I stayed, I feared we might all end up dead. I managed to slip away from the camp and began making my way through the darkness toward where I hoped to find help. My plan was to reach a main trail where I could potentially encounter other hikers or at least get close enough to civilization to contact law enforcement. It was a desperate plan, but it seemed like our only chance. The escape through the wilderness that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Without proper equipment, in challenging terrain, with dangerous people potentially pursuing me, I had to draw on every skill I'd developed over years of outdoor experience. I traveled by night to avoid detection, hiding during daylight hours, and slowly making my way toward populated areas. The journey took 3 days. 3 days during which I had no way to communicate with anyone, no way to know if my clients were safe, and no way to know if help was coming. I survived on stream water and the few edible plants I could safely identify, pushed through exhaustion and fear, and finally reached a remote road where I was able to flag down a passing truck. The driver, a local rancher, immediately recognized that I was in distress and took me to the nearest sheriff's station. I provided a detailed account of what had happened, our last known location, and the situation my clients were facing. Law enforcement responded immediately, coordinating with search and rescue teams and federal agencies to mount a rescue operation. The rescue mission was successful. My clients were found and safely recovered, though they had endured 3 additional days of captivity after my escape. The illegal operation was shut down, and several arrests were made. Everyone survived, but the traumatic experience left lasting impacts on all of us. During the immediate aftermath, I was focused entirely on the crisis at hand. I provided detailed statements to law enforcement, coordinated with emergency responders, and supported my clients through the trauma of their experience. I was staying in a small motel near the sheriff's station, operating on adrenaline and determination to see the situation through to resolution. It wasn't until the immediate crisis was resolved that I realized I had been completely out of communication with the outside world for nearly a week. My phone had been destroyed during the initial encounter, and I hadn't had access to any communication devices during my escape or the rescue operations. I had been focused entirely on survival and getting help for my clients. When I finally borrowed a phone to check my messages, I was shocked to discover dozens of missed calls and text messages from my family, my business contacts, and friends. The messages started with routine concern about my delayed check-in and escalated to panic about my disappearance. My emergency contact procedures had worked exactly as designed. When I failed to check in as scheduled, search operations had been initiated. But what I discovered next shocked me beyond anything I could have imagined. While I had been fighting for my life and the lives of my clients, while I had been making one of the most difficult journeys of my life to bring help to people counting on me, my family had been making funeral arrangements. Not just simple preparations in case the worst had happened, but actual concrete plans for my memorial service. They had chosen a funeral home, selected flowers, written obituaries, and sent invitations to relatives and friends. The service was scheduled for the following weekend, just 10 days after I had been reported missing. The messages I found painted a picture of a family that had not only given up hope quickly, but had seemed almost eager to move forward with. Closing the book on my life. Rebecca had texted updates about flower arrangements and music selections. Marcus had sent messages about legal procedures and estate matters. My mother had left voicemails discussing catering options and guest lists. Most shocking of all were the messages that revealed their assumptions about my disappearance. Rather than treating it as a temporary crisis that would likely be resolved when I was found, they had immediately jumped to the conclusion that I was dead and had begun speaking about my life in past tense. Sarah always lived dangerously, read one text from Rebecca to Marcus that had been accidentally sent to my number. I suppose we all knew something like this would happen eventually. Marcus had replied, "At least now Mom won't have to worry about her anymore." Sarah's choices were always a source of stress for the family. The most devastating message was a voicemail from my mother to a relative, describing me as always irresponsible and suggesting that my disappearance was the inevitable result of her reckless lifestyle choices. She spoke about my death as if it were a predictable conclusion rather than a tragedy. Reading these messages while sitting in a small motel room, exhausted from days of trauma and survival, felt like being punched in the stomach. Not only had my family given up on me with shocking speed, but they had used my apparent death as confirmation of their long-held beliefs about my character and choices. They weren't mourning the loss of a beloved daughter and sister who had dedicated her life to helping others experience the beauty and challenge of the natural world. They were vindicated in their belief that my lifestyle was dangerous and irresponsible, and they seemed almost relieved to finally be proven right. As I continued reading through the messages and voicemails, I realized that this wasn't just about their reaction to a crisis. This was a revelation of how they truly saw me, how they had always seen me. When faced with my potential death, they didn't remember my accomplishments, my kindness, or my strength. They remembered only their criticisms and concerns. The memorial service they were planning wasn't really about celebrating my life or mourning my loss. It was about closure for them, an opportunity to finally stop worrying about the family member who had always been a source of frustration and disappointment. Sitting in that motel room, holding a borrowed phone and reading evidence of my family's true feelings about me, I felt a clarity that I had never experienced before. For years, I had told myself that despite their criticism and dismissiveness, my family loved me in their own way. I had made excuses for their behavior, convinced myself that their concern came from a place of caring, even when it felt like judgment. Now I could see the truth. They didn't just disapprove of my choices. They actively resented my independence and were more comfortable with the idea of my death than with the reality of my life. The speed with which they had moved to funeral planning wasn't just practical efficiency. It was emotional relief. This realization brought with it a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I was seeing my family relationships clearly, without the filter of hope or denial that had allowed me to tolerate years of subtle disrespect and marginalization. I had just survived one of the most challenging experiences of my life. I had saved not only myself, but also 6 other people through courage, skill, and determination. I had proven every criticism my family had ever made about my capabilities and judgment to be wrong. And their response was to plan my funeral and speak about my death as if it were inevitable and perhaps even deserved. The contrast between this reaction and the response I was receiving from everyone else in my life was stark. My business partner had been coordinating search efforts and supporting my clients' families. My friends in the outdoor community had been volunteering their time and resources to help with the rescue operation. Even my clients' families had been expressing gratitude and concern for my well-being. David, who was out of the country on assignment and had only recently learned about my disappearance, had been frantically trying to get back to support the search efforts. His messages were filled with love, concern, and unwavering belief that I would be found alive. The difference between his response and my family's was like comparing day to night. As I sat in that motel room processing all of this information, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to simply call my family and tell them I was alive. I wasn't going to show up at their memorial service and pretend that everything was normal. I was going to respond to their reaction in a way that would force them to confront the truth about how they saw me and how they had treated me. If they wanted to hold a memorial service for me, I was going to let them. I was going to attend as a guest and see exactly what they had to say about my life when they thought I couldn't hear them. I was going to give them the opportunity to reveal their true feelings publicly. And then I was going to respond in a way that would make it impossible for them to pretend those feelings didn't exist. The plan that began forming in my mind was audacious, risky, and potentially explosive. But after years of accepting their treatment and making excuses for their behavior, after surviving a life-threatening situation only to discover that they were planning my funeral while I fought for my life, I felt ready to finally confront the reality of our family dynamic once and for all. I was done being the family member who absorbed criticism and accepted marginalization for the sake of keeping peace. I was done pretending that their version of love was acceptable or sustainable. I was done being grateful for scraps of attention and respect from people who should have been my strongest supporters. The memorial service they were planning would indeed be memorable, but not in the way they expected. It would be the moment when our family finally had an honest conversation about respect, love, and what it really means to support each other through life's challenges. As I began making plans for what would be the most dramatic confrontation of my life, I felt a mix of nerves, excitement, and deep sadness. I was sad that it had come to this, that my own family's reaction to my potential death had been so revealing and disappointing. But I was also energized by the prospect of finally standing up for myself in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. For too long, I had accepted their narrative about my life and choices. Now, it was time to tell my own story, on my own terms, and let them deal with the consequences of their years of judgment and dismissiveness. The memorial service was going to be very different from what they expected, and by the end of it, our family dynamic would be forever changed. Whether that change would ultimately be healing or destructive remained to be seen, but it was long overdue. After 37 years of being misunderstood and undervalued by the people who should have known me best, I was finally ready to demand the respect I deserved, even if it meant risking the relationships I had been trying so hard to preserve. The next few days would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the courage required to finally stand up for yourself when the people who should support you have given up on you instead. The first step in my plan required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. I couldn't simply disappear again without triggering another search operation, but I also couldn't let my family know I was alive until the memorial service. I needed to work within the system while staying completely hidden from the people who mattered most. From my motel room, I called Sheriff Martinez, the lead investigator on my case. I explained that I needed a few more days to recover before returning to normal life, and that I wanted to handle family notifications personally rather than through official channels. He was understanding, having seen how trauma victims sometimes needed time to process their experiences before facing the emotional demands of family reunions. I asked him to keep my survival confidential for 1 week, explaining that I had some personal matters to resolve before I was ready for public knowledge of my rescue. Sheriff Martinez agreed to mark my case as resolved, but keep the details sealed temporarily, allowing me the privacy I needed while ensuring that official search operations were called off. Next, I contacted my business partner, Jessica Torres, who had been managing my company during the crisis. Jessica was more than just a colleague. She was one of the few people who truly understood both my professional capabilities and my complicated family situation. When I explained what I had discovered about my family's reaction and what I was planning to do about it, her response was immediate support mixed with concern. "Sarah, are you absolutely sure about this?" Jessica asked during our encrypted video call. "What you're describing sounds like it could blow up your family relationships permanently." I had been thinking about exactly that possibility for the past 24 hours. "Jess, I've spent my entire adult life trying to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally don't respect me. They planned my funeral after 6 days. 6 days. And the things they said about my death being inevitable because of my choices, I can't unknow that." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" That question was why I trusted her completely. No judgment, no attempts to talk me out of my decision, just practical support for whatever I chose to do. I outlined my plan, and she agreed to help coordinate the logistics while maintaining the fiction that I was still missing. The plan itself was complex and required split-second timing. I would need to return to the area near my family's home without being seen by anyone who might recognize me. I would need to observe the memorial service without being detected until the moment I chose to reveal myself. Most importantly, I would need to document everything so that afterward, my family couldn't claim they had been misunderstood or taken out of context. David was the next person I contacted, and his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. He had been traveling back from a remote assignment in Alaska, completely unaware of my disappearance until he reached cell service 3 days after my rescue. The messages waiting for him had sent him into a panic that was only resolved when Jessica was able to confirm privately that I was safe. "Sarah, when I thought I had lost you, when I thought I would never see you again or tell you how much you mean to me, it put everything into perspective," David said when we finally connected. "I don't care what your family thinks about us or our relationship. I love you, and I want to be with you permanently, officially, in whatever way makes you happy." His words touched something deep inside me that I hadn't even realized was wounded. Here was someone who loved me exactly as I was, who supported my choices even when they were unconventional, who believed in my judgment and capabilities. The contrast with my family's reaction couldn't have been more stark. I told David about my discovery and my plan, expecting him to try to talk me out of such a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he offered to help. "If you're going to do this, you should have backup," he said. "Someone there who supports you completely, in case things go wrong." The idea of having David there as support was appealing, but I realized that his presence might distract from the central message I was trying to send. This confrontation needed to be about my family's treatment of me specifically, not about their disapproval of my romantic choices or lifestyle in general. "I need to do this alone," I told him. "But knowing you're there for me afterward, knowing I have someone who sees me clearly and loves what they see, that gives me the strength to face whatever happens." Over the next 3 days, I developed my plan with military precision. I studied the layout of the funeral home where the service was being held, identified the best vantage points for observation, and planned multiple escape routes in case I needed to leave quickly. I arranged for recording equipment that would DI, capture audio clearly without being visible. Most importantly, I prepared emotionally for what I was about to put myself through. Reading my family's messages about my presumed death had been painful, but I knew that hearing them speak about me at my own memorial service would be exponentially worse. I was about to learn things about how they really saw me that I could never unhear. But I also knew that this knowledge, however painful, would finally free me from any lingering hope that our relationships could improve without fundamental changes. The physical preparation required careful attention to disguise and positioning. I couldn't risk being recognized before I was ready to reveal myself, so I needed to alter my appearance significantly. I cut my hair short and dyed it darker, used makeup to change the apparent shape of my face, and chose clothing that was completely different from my usual style. Jessica helped me rent a car under her name and obtain the recording equipment I would need. She also served as my safety contact, with instructions to call law enforcement if I didn't check in at predetermined times. We both knew that what I was planning was emotionally risky, and having safeguards in place was essential. During these days of preparation, I found myself thinking deeply about the patterns that had brought me to this point. My family's reaction to my disappearance wasn't an aberration. It was the logical culmination of decades of subtle dismissiveness and conditional acceptance. They had been preparing to write me off my entire life. My actual disappearance had simply given them permission to do it officially. I thought about all the times I had made excuses for their behavior, all the times I had convinced myself that their criticism came from love rather than disappointment. I thought about the ways I had minimized my own accomplishments and needs in order to maintain family harmony. I thought about the years of accepting crumbs of attention and respect while telling myself that family relationships required compromise. The more I examined these patterns, the clearer it became that my family's reaction to my disappearance was actually a gift. It had stripped away all the polite pretenses and social expectations that had been masking the true nature of our relationships. For the first time, I was seeing them without the filter of my own hopes and their careful public personas. This clarity was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant acknowledging that the family relationships I had been trying to preserve weren't worth preserving in their current form. Liberating, because it meant I could finally stop trying to earn love and respect that were never going to be freely given. As the day of the memorial service approached, I found myself surprisingly calm. I had moved beyond anger into a state of clear-eyed determination. I wasn't doing this to hurt my family or to get revenge for their hurtful words. I was doing this to finally establish the truth about our relationships and to demand the honest conversation we should have had years ago. The morning of the service, I drove to the funeral home early and positioned myself across the street, in a coffee shop with large windows that provided a clear view of the entrance. I watched as my family members arrived, dressed in appropriately somber clothing and wearing expressions of grief that looked convincing from a distance. Rebecca arrived first with her husband David and their children. She was carrying a large, floral arrangement and appeared to be coordinating with the funeral home staff about the setup inside. Even from across the street, I could see her taking charge of the logistics with the same efficient manner she brought to all family events. Marcus arrived shortly after with his wife Jennifer, both of them dressed in expensive black clothing that looked more like business attire than morning wear. They spent several minutes in the parking lot making phone calls, and I wondered if they were handling business matters even during what should have been a time of family crisis. My mother was the last to arrive, driven by her sister Margaret, who had come in from out of town for the service. My mother walked slowly into the building, leaning heavily on Margaret's arm, and I felt a pang of guilt at the sight of her apparent distress. Despite everything, the sight of my mother in pain was difficult to witness. What struck me most as I watched these arrivals was how normal everyone looked, how composed and organized they appeared. There was no sense of ongoing crisis or desperate hope that I might still be found alive. They looked like people attending a planned event, not people still processing the shock of a sudden loss. From my position across the street, I could see guests beginning to arrive. I recognized many of the faces, relatives I hadn't seen in years, family friends, former colleagues of my parents. The attendance was larger than I had expected, and I realized that my family had put significant effort into organizing a comprehensive memorial service. At precisely the planned time, I left the coffee shop and made my way to the funeral home. I had arranged to enter through a side entrance that led to an observation area typically used by funeral home staff during services. From there, I would be able to see and hear everything while remaining hidden until I chose to reveal myself. The viewing area was separated from the main chapel by a one-way mirror that allowed me to observe without being seen. As I settled into position and tested my recording equipment, I could see that the chapel was filling with people. The setting was tastefully arranged with flowers, photos of me from various stages of my life, and a small table with what appeared to be some of my personal belongings. Looking at the photos they had chosen was emotionally jarring. Most were from years ago, before I had established my business and built my current life. There were school photos, family vacation pictures from my 20s, and a few shots from outdoor adventures that made my lifestyle look more like hobby than profession. Missing entirely were any photos that showed me in my element as a guide, working with clients, or receiving recognition for my professional accomplishments. The memorial program they had created was similarly revealing. The biography section described me as a lover of nature who enjoyed outdoor activities and worked as a guide for hiking groups. My business accomplishments, my reputation in the industry, my expertise and leadership, all of it was reduced to a hobby-level description that made me sound like an enthusiastic amateur rather than a professional. The guest book near the entrance was filling with signatures, and I could see people writing lengthy messages about their memories of me. Part of me wanted to read those messages, to see how people outside my immediate family remembered me and valued our relationships. But I knew that would have to wait until after the service itself revealed what my family truly thought about my life and choices. As the service began, my brother Marcus stepped to the podium to deliver the opening remarks. He looked composed and professional, every inch the successful attorney speaking at a formal event. His words were carefully chosen and delivered with the kind of practiced speaking skill that came from years of courtroom experience. "We gather today to remember Sarah Walsh," he began, "a woman who lived life on her own terms, sometimes to our concern, but always with passion and independence." The phrasing immediately caught my attention. "To our concern" suggested that my choices had been a source of family worry rather than pride. Marcus continued with what sounded like a prepared speech about adventure and risk-taking, but the underlying message was clear. He was portraying my life as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unconventional choices, rather than a celebration of courage and expertise. Every positive quality he mentioned was paired with a corresponding concern, or limitation. Sarah was brave, perhaps sometimes too brave for her own good, he said. She was independent, sometimes to the point of isolation from those who loved her. She was adventurous, always seeking new challenges even when we worried about the risks she was taking. As I listened to Marcus's carefully diplomatic eulogy, I realized he was doing exactly what he had always done, managing the family narrative to present the most acceptable version of events. He wasn't lying about me, but he was framing my life in a way that justified their treatment of me while avoiding any acknowledgement of their own failures to understand or support me. When Marcus finished and returned to his seat, Rebecca approached the podium. Her demeanor was more emotional than Marcus's, and she began by dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before speaking. Her approach was more personal and seemed more genuinely affected by the loss, but her words revealed the same underlying attitudes that Marcus had expressed more diplomatically. "Sarah was my little sister, and I always worried about her," Rebecca began. "From the time we were children, she was the one who climbed too high, wandered too far, and refused to listen when we tried to keep her safe." Again, the framing positioned my independence as a character flaw rather than a strength. Rebecca shared several childhood memories that painted me as reckless and difficult to control. She talked about my teenage years as a period when I rejected our family's values in favor of her own path. She described my career choices as unconventional decisions that often left us worried about her stability and future. We always hoped Sarah would eventually settle down and find a more secure way of life, Rebecca continued. We worried that her choices would lead to exactly this kind of tragedy. And while we're devastated to lose her, we can't say we're entirely surprised that her lifestyle caught up with her in the end. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca was essentially saying that my presumed death was a predictable consequence of my life choices, that they had been expecting something like this to happen because of who I was and how I lived. The grief in her voice seemed genuine, but it was grief mixed with a vindicated sense of having been right about me all along. After Rebecca finished her remarks, my mother slowly made her way to the podium. She looked genuinely frail and was clearly struggling with strong emotions. Of all my family members, she appeared to be the most genuinely affected by my loss, and I found myself hoping that her words would reveal a depth of love and understanding that her previous messages had not shown. My mother began by talking about the challenges of raising 3 children as a single parent after my father's death. She spoke about wanting to protect us and guide us towards secure, stable lives. She talked about her fears and worries as we each made our way in the world, but her focus kept returning to me as the child who had caused her the most concern. Sarah was always my wild child, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. From the moment she could walk, she was running toward things that frightened me. She climbed trees that were too tall, explored places that were too remote, and made choices that kept me awake at night with worry. My mother's words were more loving than those of my siblings, but they revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. She saw my strength and independence as sources of anxiety rather than pride. She viewed my professional accomplishments as dangerous hobbies rather than meaningful achievements. I always hoped that someday Sarah would find someone who could convince her to choose a safer path, my mother continued. I prayed that she would have children who would give her a reason to prioritize security over adventure. I dreamed of the day when she would call me for advice instead of disappearing into the wilderness for weeks at a time. As I listened to my mother's tearful words, I realized that her love for me was real, but fundamentally conditional. She loved the person she wanted me to be, not the person I actually was. Her grief was genuine, but it was grief for her unfulfilled hopes rather than for the life I had actually built and the person I had actually become. The most painful part of my mother's eulogy was her description of our last conversation. She talked about how she had tried once again to convince me to consider a more conventional career, and how I had dismissed her concerns, as I always did. She presented this conversation as evidence of her loving worry and my stubborn refusal to accept guidance. I told Sarah that I was proud of her independence but worried about her future, my mother said. She assured me that she was happy and successful, but a mother's heart knows when her child is on a dangerous path. I only wish I had tried harder to reach her before it was too late. My mother's version of our last conversation was so different from my memory that I wondered if we had been in the same room. She had spent that entire visit criticizing my choices and expressing disappointment in my lifestyle. When I had tried to share my excitement about expanding my business, she had dismissed it as risky and temporary. When I had talked about my happiness and fulfillment, she had suggested that I was deluding myself about the sustainability of my choices. Now she was rewriting that conversation to cast herself as the loving, concerned mother and me as the stubborn daughter who refused to accept wise guidance. It was revisionist history that served her emotional needs while completely erasing my actual perspective and experience. After my mother finished speaking, the service opened for anyone who wanted to share memories or thoughts. Several family members and friends came forward, and their words provided an interesting contrast to what my immediate family had said. My cousin Daniel, who I had guided on several hiking trips over the years, spoke about my expertise and professionalism. He talked about how safe and confident he had felt under my guidance, and how much he had learned about wilderness skills and environmental awareness. His words painted a picture of someone who was highly competent and deeply knowledgeable, the opposite of the reckless amateur my family had described. Patricia Williams, my regular client who had discovered hiking in her 60s, spoke about how I had changed her life by helping her discover capabilities she never knew she had. She talked about my patience as an instructor, my wisdom as a guide, and my gift for helping people overcome their fears and limitations. Her description of me was that of a professional who had made a meaningful difference in many lives. Dr. Michael Chen spoke about our friendship and the role my guided trips had played in helping him maintain his mental health during difficult periods. He described me as someone with exceptional judgment and leadership abilities, someone who could be trusted with people's safety and well-being in challenging situations. The contrast between these testimonials and my family's eulogies was stark and revealing. People who knew me professionally spoke about competence, leadership, and positive impact. People who had worked with me described expertise, safety consciousness, and meaningful service to others. Meanwhile, my own family spoke about recklessness, stubbornness, and poor judgment. As the service continued, I began to see a pattern that I had never noticed before. My family's inability to see my strengths and accomplishments wasn't just about disagreement with my lifestyle choices. It was about their need to maintain a narrative where they were the responsible, successful ones and I was the problematic family member who needed guidance and correction. Acknowledging my professional success and personal fulfillment would have required them to question their own assumptions and perhaps admit that their concerns and criticisms had been misplaced. It was easier to maintain their existing beliefs by reframing my accomplishments as luck or by focusing exclusively on perceived risks and problems. This realization was both illuminating and deeply sad. My family's treatment of me wasn't really about me at all. It was about their own emotional needs and their investment in being right about the judgments they had been making for years. Changing their perception of me would have required them to acknowledge that they had been wrong, and that acknowledgement was apparently too threatening for them to consider. As the formal part of the service concluded, and people began moving to a reception area, I prepared for the most difficult part of my plan. I had learned what I needed to learn about my family's true feelings, and now it was time to reveal myself and force the honest conversation that was long overdue. The recording equipment had captured everything clearly, and I had all the evidence I needed to support my perspective when my family inevitably claimed they had been misunderstood. I had given them the opportunity to speak freely about me without any concern for my feelings or reactions, and they had revealed exactly what I had suspected but never wanted to admit. Now it was time to step out of the shadows and finally demand the respect and understanding I had been seeking my entire life. Whatever happened next, I knew that our family relationships would never be the same. The question was whether that change would ultimately lead to something healthier and more honest, or whether it would mean the end of family connections that had never been as strong as I had hoped they were. As I prepared to make my entrance, I felt a strange mix of nervousness and peace. I was about to do something that could not be undone, something that would force all of us to confront truths we had been avoiding for decades. But I was also about to finally stop pretending that surface-level family harmony was worth more than genuine respect and understanding. The time for compromise and accommodation was over. It was time for truth, even if that truth was more painful than the comfortable illusions we had all been maintaining. My family was about to learn that I was very much alive, and more importantly, they were about to learn that I had heard every word they had said about my life and death. The memorial service they had planned was about to become something none of us would ever forget, and by the time it was over, we would all have a much clearer understanding of what our relationships actually meant and whether they were worth preserving in their current form. I took a deep breath, checked my recording equipment one final time, and prepared to step into the reception area where my family was receiving condolences for my death. The next few minutes would change everything, and there would be no going back to the way things had been before. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to demand complete honesty from my family, and I was prepared to deal with whatever consequences that honesty might bring. The daughter they thought they had lost forever was about to walk back into their lives, and she was no longer willing to accept anything less than the truth about what their love really meant. The reception area buzzed with quiet conversation, as guests offered condolences to my family and shared their own memories of me. I watched from the doorway, still hidden in the shadows, as my mother accepted embraces and tearful words from relatives and friends. Rebecca stood beside her, graciously thanking people for their attendance while Marcus worked the room with the practiced social skills of someone accustomed to networking events. I waited until most of the guests had moved through the receiving line and were gathered around tables laden with catered food. The timing needed to be perfect, dramatic enough to make my point, but not so disruptive that it would traumatize the elderly relatives or children who had come to pay their respects. Taking one final deep breath, I stepped out of the shadows and into the reception area. For a moment, I simply stood there, allowing people to notice me gradually. The first person to see me was my cousin Daniel, who had spoken so eloquently about my professional abilities during the service. His face went completely white, and he dropped the coffee cup he was holding. The sound of breaking porcelain caused heads to turn in my direction, and I watched as recognition dawned on face after face. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the crowd as people struggled to process what they were seeing. Some guests looked confused, wondering if I was a relative they didn't recognize. Others realized immediately who I was and stood frozen in shock. My mother was facing away from me, talking to her sister Margaret when the commotion began. Margaret's eyes widened as she looked over my mother's shoulder, and she began stuttering incoherently. My mother turned around slowly, following Margaret's gaze, and when her eyes met mine, she let out a sound that was part scream, part sob. "Sarah?" she whispered, her hand flying to her chest. "Sarah? Is that really you?" The entire room had fallen silent except for my mother's ragged breathing and a few whispered conversations as people tried to understand what was happening. I walked slowly toward my family, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Rebecca looked like she was seeing a ghost, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and something that might have been fear. Marcus had gone completely still, his attorney's training apparently insufficient to help him process this unprecedented situation. "Hello, Mom," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "I'm sorry I'm late to my own memorial service." My mother staggered backward, and David had to catch her arm to keep her from falling. She was staring at me as if I might disappear at any moment, her eyes wide with disbelief and something that looked almost like terror. "But you're dead," she said in a broken whisper. "You're supposed to be dead. They said you were missing, that there was no hope." The phrasing of her words struck me immediately. Not, "We thought you were dead," or "We feared you were dead," but "You're supposed to be dead." As if my being alive was somehow a violation of the natural order, rather than a miracle to be celebrated. "I was missing," I confirmed, keeping my voice calm and steady. "For 6 days. I was fighting for my life and the lives of 6 other people who depended on me. But apparently, 6 days was long enough for you to give up hope and start planning my funeral." Rebecca found her voice first, though it came out as a strangled croak. "Sarah, we don't understand. Where have you been? Why didn't you contact us? Do you have any idea what we've been through?" The question made me laugh, though there was no humor in the sound. "What you've been through? Rebecca, I know exactly what you've been through. I know because I've been listening to every word of it." I pulled out my phone and played back a portion of Rebecca's eulogy, her voice filling the silent reception hall. "We always hoped Sarah would eventually settle down and find a more secure way of life. We worried that her choices would lead to exactly this kind of tragedy. And while we're devastated to lose her, we can't say we're entirely surprised that her lifestyle caught up with her in the end." The color drained from Rebecca's face as she heard her own words played back to her. Around the room, guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple case of mistaken death. "You recorded the service?" Marcus asked, his legal mind immediately jumping to the implications. "Sarah, that's a violation of privacy. You had no right to—" "I had no right?" I interrupted, my voice rising for the first time. "Marcus, you just spent 20 minutes telling a room full of people that my death was the predictable result of my poor judgment and reckless choices. You stood at a podium and delivered a eulogy that was basically a character assassination, disguised as grief. And you're worried about my recording it?" Marcus's wife, Jennifer, tugged at his arm, clearly sensing that this was not a legal battle he wanted to fight. Several guests had begun quietly moving toward the exits, recognizing that they were witnessing a private family confrontation that was about to become very ugly. My mother was still staring at me as if I were an apparition. "Sarah, sweetheart, you're alive," she said, reaching toward me with trembling hands. "That's all that matters. You're alive and you're safe and you're home." I stepped back from her outstretched hands, shaking my head. "No, Mom, that's not all that matters. What matters is that when you thought I was dead, when you had the opportunity to speak honestly about who I was and what my life meant, you chose to remember me as a disappointment. You chose to frame my death as a cautionary tale rather than a tragedy." "That's not true," my mother protested, tears streaming down her face. "We love you. We've always loved you. We were devastated when you went missing." "Were you?" I asked, pulling out my phone again. "Because the messages you left while I was fighting for my life tell a very different story." I played back her voicemail to a relative, her voice clearly audible. "Sarah was always irresponsible. I suppose we all knew something like this would happen eventually. At least now I won't have to worry about her anymore." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My mother's face crumpled as she heard her own voice expressing relief at my presumed death. Around the room, the remaining guests were looking everywhere except at us, clearly uncomfortable with the level of family dysfunction being displayed. "I never meant—" my mother began, but I cut her off. "You never meant for me to hear it," I said. "You never meant for me to know what you really thought about my life and choices. But I did hear it, Mom. I heard every word of dismissal, every expression of relief, every suggestion that my death was somehow inevitable and perhaps even deserved." Rebecca stepped forward, her teacher's instincts apparently kicking in as she tried to manage the situation. "Sarah, you're obviously traumatized by whatever happened to you. You're not thinking clearly. Let us help you. Let us take care of you." "Take care of me?" I repeated incredulously. "Rebecca, you just told a room full of people that you weren't surprised my lifestyle caught up with me. You described my death as a predictable consequence of my poor choices. And now you want to take care of me?" "I was grieving," Rebecca said defensively. "People say things when they're grieving that they don't really mean. You can't hold us accountable for words spoken in a moment of loss and pain." "Grieving?" I asked. "Is that what you call it?" Because from where I was sitting, it sounded a lot more like vindication. It sounded like you were finally proven right about all the concerns you've been expressing about my choices for years. Marcus had recovered enough of his composure to attempt damage control. "Sarah, I think we all need to take a step back here. You've obviously been through a traumatic experience, and you're interpreting things in the worst possible light. We were trying to honor your memory in a way that—" "In a way that what?" I interrupted. "In a way that justified your treatment of me while I was alive? In a way that absolved you of any responsibility for the distance in our relationships? Marcus, you described my life like it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of independence." I had recorded his entire eulogy, and I played back the most damning portion. Sarah was brave, perhaps sometimes too brave for her own good. She was independent, sometimes to the point of isolation from those who loved her. She was adventurous, always seeking new challenges, even when we worried about the risks she was taking. Every single positive quality you mentioned came with a qualifier, I continued. You couldn't even praise my courage without suggesting it was excessive. You couldn't acknowledge my independence without framing it as a character flaw that led to isolation. The few remaining guests were now openly staring, no longer pretending to give us privacy. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, and I realized that word of this confrontation would spread quickly through our extended family and social circles. But I was beyond caring about public embarrassment or family reputation. Do you want to know what actually happened to me during those 6 days you spent planning my funeral? I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the reception hall. I saved 6 people's lives. I escaped from armed criminals who were holding us hostage. I traveled 3 days through wilderness terrain without food or proper equipment to bring. Help to people who were counting on me. I displayed exactly the kind of courage, independence, and judgment that you've been criticizing my entire adult life. My mother was sobbing openly now, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her cheeks. Sarah, please, she begged. Please don't do this. Not here, not in front of everyone. Where else should I do it, Mom? I asked. Should I do it in private, where you can deny it happened or claim I misunderstood? Should I do it at another family gathering where you can dismiss my concerns and change the subject? I've tried talking to you privately for 37 years, and it's gotten me nowhere. David, Rebecca's husband, finally spoke up. Sarah, maybe we should all go somewhere private to discuss this. The children are here, and this is getting very intense. I looked around and saw Rebecca's teenagers, Emily and Jacob, standing near the back of the room with wide eyes and confused expressions. They had just attended what they thought was their aunt's memorial service, only to have that aunt appear. Alive and furious. I felt a stab of guilt for traumatizing them, but I also realized they needed to understand the family dynamics they were growing up within. The children should hear this, I said firmly. They should understand what happens. In this family, when someone chooses a path that doesn't meet with approval, they should know that love in this family comes with conditions and expiration dates. Rebecca stepped protectively in front of her children. Don't you dare involve my kids in this, Sarah. Whatever issues you have with us, you leave them out of it. Your kids are already involved, Rebecca, I replied. They're learning from watching how this family treats its members. They're absorbing lessons about loyalty, support, and what it means to love someone unconditionally. Do you want them to learn that family gives up on you after 6 days? Do you want them to learn that your death becomes an opportunity for others to feel vindicated about their judgments? Jennifer, Marcus's wife, had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now she stepped forward. Sarah, I understand you're hurt and angry, but this public confrontation isn't helping anyone. Your family was trying to honor your memory in the best way they knew how. Honor my memory? I laughed bitterly. Jennifer, did you hear the same eulogies I did? Because the people who spoke about honoring my memory were my clients and colleagues, people who knew me professionally and respected my expertise. My own family used my memorial service as an opportunity to explain why my death was predictable and perhaps even inevitable. I turned back to my mother, who was still crying and reaching toward me as if physical contact could somehow repair the damage that had been done. Mom, do you remember what you said in your eulogy about hoping I would find someone who could convince me to choose a safer path? She nodded tearfully, and I continued. I have found someone like that. His name is David Murphy, and we've been together for 2 years. But I didn't tell you about him because I knew you would turn our relationship into another referendum on my choices. I knew you would pressure him to change me instead of celebrating the fact that I had found someone who loves me exactly as I am. My mother's expression shifted from grief to confusion to something that might have been hope. You're seeing someone? Sarah, that's wonderful. Why didn't you tell us? Because he loves me for who I am, not for who he might be able to convince. me to become, I explained. He supports my career instead of criticizing it. He admires my independence instead of seeing it as a problem to be solved. And when he thought I had died, his reaction was grief for the person he was losing, not relief that I had finally stopped worrying him. The contrast I was drawing was clear to everyone in the room. While my family had been planning my funeral and expressing relief at no longer having to worry about my choices, someone who truly loved me had been frantically trying to get back to support search efforts. Marcus, perhaps recognizing that his family was losing this confrontation badly, tried a different approach. Sarah, if you've been in a relationship for 2 years and didn't tell us, that suggests you've been pulling away from family connections. Maybe our concerns about your isolation weren't unfounded. My isolation? I repeated incredulously. Marcus, I've attended every family gathering for the past 5 years. I've called Mom every week. I've sent birthday cards and Christmas. Gifts and congratulations on promotions and graduations. How is that isolation? But you didn't share important parts of your life with us, Rebecca added. You kept your relationship secret. You never asked for our advice or support. That's a form of emotional distance. I kept my relationship private because I knew you would use it as another opportunity to criticize my choices, I explained. I didn't ask for your advice because every piece of advice you've ever given me has been about changing who I am, rather than supporting who I've chosen to be. I pulled out my phone again and showed them the screen. Would you like to see the messages David sent while he thought I was dead? Would you like to see what grief looks like when it comes from someone who actually loves and respects the person they're losing? My mother reached for the phone, but I pulled it back. No, Mom. You don't get to see those messages. You don't get to read about real love and support and then claim that your version of love is equivalent. Your version of love comes with so many conditions and criticisms that it's barely recognizable as love at all. The room had fallen silent again, except for my mother's continued sobbing. The few remaining guests were looking anywhere but at us, clearly desperate to escape but unsure how to leave gracefully. Patricia Williams, my elderly client who had spoken so beautifully about me during the service, approached slowly. Sarah, dear, she said gently, I don't know what's happened here, but I want you to know that everything I said about you during the service was true. You changed my life for the better, and you've done the same for many other people. Her words, coming from someone who saw me clearly and valued my contributions, provided a stark contrast to my family's responses. I felt tears welling up for the first time since revealing myself, overwhelmed by the difference between Patricia's genuine affection and my family's conditional love. Thank you, Patricia, I said, my voice thick with emotion. That means more to me than you know. My mother seemed to recognize that Patricia's words carried a weight and authenticity that her own had lacked. Sarah, sweetheart, please, she said desperately. Let us try again. Let us learn how to love you better. Don't give up on us. I looked at her tear-streaked face, at Rebecca's defensive posture, at Marcus's calculating expression as he tried to figure out how to manage this crisis. I thought about the years of criticism disguised as concern, the decades of feeling like I had to earn approval that was never quite within reach. I'm not giving up on you, Mom, I said quietly. But I'm also not going to keep pretending that surface-level family harmony is worth more than genuine respect and understanding. I'm not going to keep accepting crumbs of conditional love while telling myself it's enough. Rebecca stepped forward again, her voice desperate now. What do you want from us, Sarah? Tell us what you need, and we'll try to give it to you. I want you to see me, I said simply. I want you to see who I actually am, instead of focusing on who you think I should be. I want you to acknowledge that my choices have led to a successful, fulfilling life, rather than constantly predicting doom and disaster. I want you to be proud of my accomplishments instead of worried about my risks. We are proud of you, my mother insisted. We've always been proud of you. No, Mom, I replied sadly. You've been proud of the potential you saw in me to become someone different. You've never been proud of who I actually am. And the fact that you used my memorial service to express relief at no longer having to worry about my choices proves that your love has always been more about your comfort than my happiness. The truth of that statement seemed to hit my family, like a physical blow. My mother's sobbing intensified, Rebecca looked stricken, and Marcus appeared to be processing the legal implications of having this conversation recorded and potentially made public. So what happens now? Marcus asked, his attorney's pragmatism asserting itself. Where do we go from here? I looked around the reception hall, at the abandoned memorial displays with their outdated photos and dismissive biography, at the guests, who were still trying to process what they had witnessed, at my family members who looked lost and shaken. Now you have a choice, I said. You can dismiss this confrontation as the product of trauma and stress, go back to treating me the same way you always have, and hope I'll forget what I learned about your true feelings. Or you can use this as an opportunity to examine why your immediate reaction to my disappearance was to plan my funeral rather than maintain hope, and why your eulogies focused on my failures rather than my successes. My mother wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. Sarah, you're our daughter. We love you no matter what. Can't we just start over? Starting over requires acknowledging what went wrong the first time, I replied. It requires understanding why I felt the need to record this service in the first place. It requires admitting that your version of love has been lacking and committing to doing better. I looked directly at each of them in turn. I'm willing to work toward better relationships with all of you, but not if it means going back to the way things were. Not if it means accepting criticism disguised as concern and conditional support disguised as love. Not if it means pretending that planning my funeral after 6 days was a reasonable response to my disappearance. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions and unresolved tensions. I knew that this confrontation had changed everything between us, but I wasn't sure yet whether that change would ultimately be positive or destructive. What I did know was that I was done accepting less than I deserved from the people who were supposed to love me most. I was done making excuses for their behavior and minimizing their impact on my well-being. I was done being grateful for scraps of attention and respect. Whether they chose to rise to the challenge of building healthier relationships or whether they chose to maintain their existing patterns was up to them. But either way, I would know where I stood, and I would make my decisions about future family involvement based on their actions rather than my hopes. The memorial service they had planned to give them closure on my life had instead opened up every unresolved issue in our family relationships. Whether we could find a way to address those issues constructively remained to be seen, but there was no going back to the comfortable illusions we had all been maintaining. For better or worse, the truth was finally out in the open, and we would all have to find a way to live with the consequences of that honesty. 6 months after the memorial service confrontation, my life had transformed in ways I never could have anticipated. The immediate aftermath of revealing myself had been chaotic and emotionally exhausting, but it had also created space for genuine healing and growth that wouldn't have been possible while maintaining our previous patterns. The first few weeks following the confrontation were the most difficult. My family had scattered from the funeral home in various states of shock and distress, leaving me alone in the reception hall with a handful of bewildered guests and the evidence of 3 decades of unresolved family dysfunction. Patricia Williams had stayed with me, offering quiet support as I processed what had just happened and figured out my next steps. David had driven through the night to reach me after I called him from the funeral home. When he arrived and found me sitting in my rental car in the parking lot, still wearing my disguise and clutching the recording device that had captured my family's true feelings, he simply held me while I cried for the first time since my rescue. "I'm proud of you," he said when I finally told him everything that had transpired. "I know that was incredibly painful, but you finally stood up for yourself in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed." His unwavering support provided a stark contrast to my family's reaction over the following days. Instead of calls expressing relief at my survival or attempts to understand my perspective, I received a series of angry messages accusing me of manipulation, emotional terrorism, and deliberately humiliating them in public. Rebecca's initial response was to demand that I delete the recordings and agree never to speak publicly about what had happened. She seemed genuinely shocked that I had documented their words, and even more shocked that I had played those recordings back to them, in front of witnesses. Marcus approached the situation like the legal problem he perceived it to be, sending me a formal letter outlining his concerns about privacy violations and threatening legal action if I shared the recordings with anyone outside our immediate family. His letter made no mention of the content of those recordings or any acknowledgement that their words might have been hurtful. My mother's response was the most complex and ultimately the most hopeful. She alternated between tearful phone calls begging me to forgive and forget, angry voicemails accusing me of cruelty, and long text messages attempting to explain or justify the things she had said during my memorial service. For the first month, I didn't respond to any of their communications. I needed time to process my own emotions and decide how I wanted to move forward. I had achieved my goal of forcing an honest conversation about our family dynamics, but I hadn't anticipated how emotionally drained I would feel in the aftermath. Jessica, my business partner, helped me maintain professional responsibilities, while I took time to recover. The story of my survival and rescue had made local news, and I found myself fielding interview requests and dealing with increased attention for my business. The irony wasn't lost on me that strangers were celebrating my survival and expertise, while my own family was still focused on their embarrassment and anger. The turning point came when my cousin Daniel called me directly. He had been at the memorial service and witnessed the entire confrontation, and his perspective provided valuable outside validation of what I had experienced. "Sarah, I've been thinking about everything that happened that day," he said. "I have to tell you, as someone who's known your family my whole life, nothing you said came as a surprise. We've all watched the way they treat you over the years, and most of us have been uncomfortable with it but didn't know how to address it." Daniel's words opened my eyes to something I hadn't considered. My family's treatment of me hadn't gone unnoticed by our extended family and friends. Other people had seen the patterns of dismissiveness and conditional support, but they had felt as powerless to address it as I had. "When you played back those recordings," Daniel continued, "you weren't revealing anything new about their attitudes. You were just making it impossible for them to deny what we've all observed for years." This conversation led me to reach out to other family members and longtime friends, and I discovered that my experience wasn't isolated or imaginary. Multiple people confirmed that they had noticed my family's treatment of me and had often felt uncomfortable with the dynamics they observed. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, was particularly supportive. "Your father would have been horrified by the way they've treated you," he told me during a long phone conversation. "He was so proud of your independence and strength. He always said you were the most like him of all his children." These conversations helped me understand that the problem wasn't with my perception or sensitivity. The problem was with patterns of behavior that had become so normalized within my immediate family that they couldn't see how destructive and hurtful they had become. Armed with this clarity and support, I decided to respond to my family's communications. I wrote individual letters to each of them, acknowledging the pain of our confrontation while also clearly stating my boundaries and expectations for any future relationship. To Rebecca, I wrote, "I understand that you're embarrassed and angry about what happened at the memorial service, but your embarrassment doesn't erase the fact that you stood at a podium and described my death as unsurprising because of my lifestyle choices. Until you can acknowledge how hurtful those words were and commit to changing the way you speak about my life and choices, I'm not interested in pretending everything is normal between us." To Marcus, I wrote, "Your response to our Confrontation has been to threaten legal action rather than examine your own behavior. This tells me that you're more concerned with managing the consequences of your words than with understanding why those words were problematic. I'm not interested in a relationship where I have to manage your comfort by staying silent about my own experience. To my mother, I wrote the longest and most detailed letter, outlining specific examples of her treatment over the years and explaining how her words at the memorial service had revealed the conditional nature of her love. I ended with, "I love you, Mom, but I can't continue accepting a relationship where your love depends on my conforming to your expectations. If you want a genuine relationship with me, it has to be based on who I am, not who you wish I could become." The responses to these letters varied dramatically. Marcus never replied directly, though I heard through other family members that he was consulting with colleagues about whether my actions constituted some form of harassment or defamation. His silence told me everything I needed to know about his priorities and his capacity for self-reflection. Rebecca initially responded with more anger, accusing me of being vindictive and unforgiving. But after several weeks, she sent a shorter message acknowledging that some of her words at the memorial service had been hurtful and expressing willingness to work on our relationship. It wasn't a full acknowledgement or apology, but it was a starting point. My mother's response was the most genuine and ultimately the most hopeful. She called me 2 weeks after receiving my letter and, for the first time in my memory, spoke to me without defensiveness or attempts at justification. "Sarah, I've been reading your letter over and over," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I've been thinking about all the examples you gave, and I'm starting to see patterns I never noticed before. I don't think I understood how my constant worry was actually a form of criticism." This conversation led to a series of phone calls where my mother began the difficult work of examining her own behavior and its impact on our relationship. She started therapy to explore her parenting patterns and their roots in her own childhood experiences. The progress was slow and sometimes frustrating. My mother would make genuine insights and commitments, then slip back into old patterns of criticism disguised as concern. But the difference was that now she was aware of these patterns and willing to be called out when they occurred. During one particularly difficult conversation, she said, "I'm realizing that my love for you has been tangled up with my fears about you. I was so afraid something bad would happen to you that I couldn't see all the good things that were already happening." This acknowledgement was more meaningful to me than any apology could have been. It showed that she was beginning to understand the fundamental problem with our relationship and was committed to changing it. The changes in my mother's approach became evident during our first in-person meeting 3 months after the memorial service. She visited my cabin for the first time ever, and instead of focusing on what she saw as limitations or risks, she expressed genuine admiration for what I had created. "Sarah, this place is beautiful," she said, walking through the rooms. "I had renovated myself. You've built something really special here. I can see why you love this life." It was a small moment, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she saw me and my choices. For the first time, she was looking at my life through the lens of appreciation rather than anxiety. David had been patient and supportive throughout this entire process of family reconciliation. When I introduced him to my mother during that first cabin visit, I watched carefully for signs of the judgment and interference I had always feared. Instead, I saw my mother making a genuine effort to get to know him as a person rather than as a project to be managed. "David, Sarah tells me you're a conservation photographer," she said. "That must be fascinating work. How did you get started in that field?" The conversation that followed was natural and respectful, with my mother asking genuine questions and listening to the answers without offering unsolicited advice or expressing concerns about the challenges of his career. Later, after David had left, my mother said, "I can see why you love him. He clearly adores you and respects what you do. I'm sorry I wasn't ready to meet him sooner." This apology represented growth that went far beyond our specific conflict. It showed that my mother was beginning to understand how her behavior had affected my willingness to share important parts of my life with her. Rebecca's progress was more limited but still meaningful. She attended family therapy sessions with me, where we worked through some of our childhood dynamics and their impact on our adult relationship. She struggled with acknowledging the full extent of her dismissive behavior, but she did make efforts to change her communication patterns. The first time she asked me about my work without immediately expressing concerns or offering suggestions for improvement, I almost cried. It was such a small thing, but it represented a recognition of my expertise and autonomy that I had been seeking my entire life. Marcus remained largely absent from this reconciliation process. He attended a few family dinners, where he was polite, but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamics that required emotional honesty rather than surface-level pleasantries. Eventually, I accepted that he might not be capable of the kind of relationship I was seeking, and I stopped pushing for something he couldn't or wouldn't provide. The most surprising development was how the confrontation had affected other family relationships. Several cousins reached out to share their own experiences with family criticism and conditional support. My cousin Daniel started his own conversations with his parents about patterns he had observed in their family dynamics. Patricia Williams, who had witnessed the entire memorial service confrontation, became an unexpected ally and friend. She often called to check on my progress with family reconciliation, offering wisdom from her decades of experience as a social worker. "What you did that day took tremendous courage," she told me during one of our conversations. "It's not easy to demand better treatment from people you love, especially when they're not ready to hear it. But sometimes forcing uncomfortable truths into the open is the only way to create space for real change." Her words helped me understand that the confrontation, while painful, had been necessary. Years of gentle attempts to address these issues had failed to create meaningful change. Sometimes dramatic action was required to break through entrenched patterns and force honest communication. My business continued to thrive, and I found that the clarity I had gained about my family relationships had improved my confidence in other areas of life. I was more assertive with difficult clients, more willing to charge appropriately for my expertise, and more confident in my professional judgment. David and I had also deepened our relationship significantly. The crisis had shown us both how much we meant to each other, and we began making more concrete plans for our future together. We got engaged during a climbing trip to Yosemite, with David proposing at sunrise from a summit we had reached together. When I called my mother to share the engagement news, her response was everything I had hoped for. "Sarah, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you both. David is a good man, and I can see how much he loves you." The wedding planning process became an opportunity to practice our new family dynamics. My mother offered to help with arrangements without trying to take over or criticize my choices. Rebecca contributed ideas and support without expressing concerns about unconventional elements David and I wanted to include. Most importantly, they both seemed genuinely excited about celebrating our relationship rather than viewing it as another opportunity to express worry or disappointment about my choices. The wedding itself was a small outdoor ceremony held near my cabin, with guests including family members, close friends, and several of my regular clients who had become important parts of my life. During the reception, my mother gave a toast. That brought me to tears. "Sarah has always been our adventurous spirit," she said, "and I'm finally old enough and wise enough to see that as the gift it is, rather than the worry I made it. She's built a beautiful life doing work she loves, with people who appreciate her talents. David, we're so grateful that you see and celebrate the same wonderful qualities in Sarah that we're learning to celebrate too." It wasn't a perfect speech, and it didn't erase decades of hurt feelings, but it represented genuine progress and a commitment to doing better going forward. As I looked around at the wedding reception, seeing my family interacting naturally with my friends and colleagues, seeing my mother asking David's parents thoughtful questions about their lives, seeing Rebecca's children playing with other kids. Without the tension that had characterized previous family gatherings, I felt a deep sense of peace. The confrontation at my memorial service had been one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it had created space for authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than surface-level harmony. Not every family relationship had been salvaged, but the ones that had been were stronger and more honest than they had ever been before. The woman who had walked into that memorial service 6 months earlier had been desperate to be seen and understood by people who seemed determined to misunderstand her. The woman celebrating her wedding was surrounded by people who saw her clearly and loved what they saw. The memorial service my family had planned was supposed to provide them with closure on my life. Instead, it had opened up possibilities for new kinds of relationships based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to let them settle for less than genuine connection, even when that refusal initially causes pain. As David and I danced under the stars near my cabin, surrounded by family and friends who had chosen to love us as we were, rather than as they wished we could be, I knew that surviving those 6 days in the wilderness had been only the beginning of my journey toward real freedom. The courage I had found to escape from physical danger had also given me the courage to escape from emotional patterns that had been holding me back for decades. The skills that had saved my life in the wilderness had also taught me how to navigate the equally treacherous terrain of family relationships with strength and clarity. Looking back, I could see that the memorial service confrontation had been necessary not just for my own well-being, but for the health of our entire family system. Sometimes love requires disruption, honesty requires conflict, and growth requires the willingness to let old patterns die so that new ones can be born. The family that had planned my memorial service no longer existed, but the family that had emerged from the ashes of that confrontation was infinitely more real and ultimately more loving than what had come before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.